Good evening. Keep coming. So happy that you are joining us this evening. Really looking forward to this conversation. We have an amazing group of leaders, and I am going to find them right now. Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing fabulous. So happy that you could join us.
Yes. I'm sorry. Give me 2 seconds. I just want to make sure that we have a quiet space.
Oh, no worries, no worries. We're still waiting for everyone else. Good evening, everyone.
Hey all,
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great now that I have you both here. We are just waiting on one other leader this evening, but thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone who is sliding into IG Live right now to have this conversation with us. It's really an important one, and I think one that has been on the topic of everyone's minds. Now, where is everyone based?
So we based in Harlem.
Great. Let me see. Okay. All right. I sent a message to our last guest. But why don't we jump in and get started? Hopefully, Mark can join us shortly. We might just need to do some updates. You know, IG Live sometimes has some bugs. But I just want to thank everyone for really joining us this evening for today's Justice Now conversation. I'm Jerica Richardson, the host of Justice Now from the National Urban League, and I am our Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives. And, you know, I think this conversation is really an important one. It's been on the minds of many people. It's been a topic that's, you know, taken over the headlines in our news. And it often has, you know, been on the lips of our elected officials, all the way from the president on the way on down to our big city mayors in this country. And you guessed it, you saw the tag, you saw the title. We're talking about gun violence. But I think it sometimes can be a very loaded term. And I think we're here to really unpack what that means. And so I'd love to introduce two of my guests here. We're hoping to have a third. We're going to still keep trying to get Mark, but we are going to jump right in. So first, I have Ebony Edwards, who is an activist with Street Corner Resources based in Harlem, my very own neighborhood. So love Aisha Sekou. You all are doing amazing work on the ground here in New York. So Ebony, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Very, very.
Great. We're so happy to have you. Okay. I think this might be Mark. Okay. Let's see. Fingers crossed. All right, we'll see. I think it went through, but we'll try one more time. Let me. All right, I'll send it one more time. And now we have Zenat Yahya, who is a Deputy Policy Director. Did I get the title right for March for Our Lives?
Yep.
Awesome. Zenat, thank you so much for joining us. Alexis Confer, the Executive Director of March for Our Lives, is a great friend, and we're just so happy that she made it possible for you to join us today. And Mark, it's good to see
Yes.
you.
Thank
I
you.
know.
I apologize for my tardiness.
No worries, no worries. I saw you. You were getting on there. Sometimes IG Live has these bugs, and there's a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are here. And Mark, we're so happy to have you join us. You have held many positions. Most recently, you are the Director of Public Affairs and Public Relations for the Black Law Enforcement Alliance. And you are also one of the founding members and former spokespersons for 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. And that was based here in New York as well, right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. So why don't we jump right in, because, you know, we don't have a ton of time for this conversation, and I think there's so many issues to unpack. Mark, why don't we start with you? Gun violence is a broad category, and it's a broad category of violence. I think as someone in law enforcement or a former member of law enforcement, what does the term gun violence mean to you? We hear terms like mass shootings and, you know, urban gun violence and accidental incidences, and officer-involved shooting. Can you explain from your perspective what you consider to be gun violence?
Gun violence, from my perspective, is the commission of actions that have the potential for causing injury. Oftentimes, it is not just a singular issue. It is not a matter of a person possessing a firearm, but also the assaultive behavior that's in addition to the possession of the firearm itself. So gun violence is utilizing this particular weapon, this particular tool, this firearm, this handgun, to commit offenses against the larger community. So it's incorporating just that tool to commit these crimes.
Okay. And what do you think are one of the major drivers of gun violence in this country today, from your perspective?
Poverty. I think poverty is a major driver of it. It's not the only factor. I think what makes this issue so complicated and so oftentimes so convoluted is because there are many different issues and items that have to be dealt with or addressed, or at least introduced into the discussion. But I think poverty, in general, poverty will have an impact on criminal behavior and violence, in particular gun violence, because of just the easy access, the relative easy access to firearms, handguns in impoverished communities. You add in, a empty stomach or a mind that's focused on trying to get to the next level, and then add into that firearms, and you have really a recipe for disaster. So I think that is one factor that's involved in what is pervasive and what is driving so much of the violence that we see. But like I said, it's just one component of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point to lift up. We talk about poverty, and then oftentimes the first thing that people associate with that is an urban community or a poor rural community. But what we've seen across this country with the rise of gun violence, and, you know, every town defines it as 4 or more people, being shot. It's touched all of our communities. And, you know, it's really interesting when we hear the call and when we really see the attention and the media attention turn to this. You know, oftentimes it's when we are hearing and seeing about gun violence happening in our suburban communities. And so, Zena, can you talk to us a little bit about the terminology, you know, mass shooting, and gun violence and in the diversity of communities it touches, because I think sometimes we can be really narrow in our scope, and our media does not the media doesn't always tell the wide variety of communities that are experiencing gun violence. Would love to hear your take.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you already kind of touched on a point that I was going to get to around the media specifically, right? I think the thing is, mass shootings garner a lot of national attention and that like sensationalism, right? And that's what's often reported on versus everyday gun violence in communities, including urban gun violence, right? Gun violence in neighborhoods, also gun violence that has to do with suicide or domestic violence. And I think, that's something that we keep at the forefront. Obviously, our organization was started from a mass shooting at a school in Florida in 2018. But one thing we really try to keep in mind as we work in this GVP space as well is speaking to the root causes of gun violence, such as poverty, gun glorification, is another piece. This piece around political apathy and corruption and our legislators kind of halting the process or not moving the needle on things. And so we really try to center our work around that specifically, as those are kind of the things that we believe really fuel gun violence and really get to like addressing some of those root causes, because like you said, the communities that are affected are so diverse, and even within that, it's not very monolithic. So it's a very broad issue in a sense.
It definitely is a very broad issue. And I think one of the things that I've seen to be, really helpful is a lot of the cure violence work and programs that are happening in our community that are really focused on addressing those root causes. And when we talk about gun violence, I think so often some of the stories that really grip the attention of the public involve the loss of life with young people. So, Ebony, I want to turn it over to you to hear a little bit more about how Street Corner Resources and other cure violence organizations are really trying to address the root causes of gun violence, but also how you are working with young people and being a young person yourself and really engaging in this fight and in this movement.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So, and representing Street Corner Resources. So our main office is based off of 145th Street, and we have a catchment area where we're specifically targeting issues in the Harlem area. So our services include, our cure violence outreach. So our street is actually on the street situations that will potentially become a gun violence situation. So before we even get to going back to the house to grab what we got to defend ourselves, what are these root causes? What are these minor altercations that people are having? So that's our outreach. We also have a hospital responder program, which is we have a partnership with Harlem Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
That we are addressing the family member shot and with her. So that has provided us with a lot of access to helping people prevent retaliation with what
Yeah. Ebony, I'm catching almost every other word.
Oh my.
I don't know if it's with if it's your headphones or something, but we're losing your audio.
Okay.
And I'm hearing great nuggets, and I want to make sure everybody hears them again.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me better now?
Oh, it's perfect.
Okay. I'll hold it up. Thank you so much. Okay, so yes, just to repeat, we have our cure violence outreach program. So this is our street team that is going out into the streets and actually de-escalating the situations that could potentially become dangerous and fatal to our community. And then further on, we have our hospital responder program, which is with connection with Harlem Hospital, where we're able to actually enter into the hospital and make connections with these people, family of the victims, and other people who would otherwise retaliate and get into, a negative spiral of inflicting violence on each other. So it really starts at the root of those minor altercations that end up escalating. So all the work that we do is about de-escalation. We also have professional mental health services with a licensed social worker, whom we call our credible clinician. So we have that connection as well, and we're able to refer people to the greater access that they need. We also have our mobile trauma unit, which I'm sitting in right now. We call it our Peace Feast, a nice, grand mobile unit that has allowed us to provide access to the community instead of, people always have an excuse. Why can't you come into the office? We'll come to you. No worries. So, we provide the services, and we really do, as a young person, again, this summer, I've been co-directing the Summer Performance Ensemble, which is Street Corner Resources Summer Youth Employment Program. So with this program, we are creating artivism, where we're creating dance numbers, songs, and different things with those, popular rhythms and beats that make you groove, even the young people, but with messages speaking peace and, de-escalating of violence. So instead of your no music, it's no violence. Yeah. So we have lots of different numbers that really inspire people and even teach people about different things. We have a whole number about CPR and the steps that you need to take. It's really just about empowering each other so that when situations do occur, it's like, what do we do? If we don't go grab the gun, what else is there? There's prevention, there's shouting out anything you can to just distract the people from that negative energy and that violence. So that's what we do with Street Corner Resources.
Amazing and amazing work. I will say empowerment is an important piece, but I also want to point out that truth telling is equally important. And so I saw some of the comments in the chat. There was a comment from someone that talked about being poor and elderly and being a veteran, and that's saying that, poverty isn't the issue, it's minorities that are the issues. And I want to push back on that, because I think it's important when we are talking about gun violence in this country to recognize that it is just not a black or brown issue. It is something that's impacting all of us. And unfortunately, violence is part of the American story. We've seen it from slavery, from the imprisonment of Asian Americans. We've seen it with, unfortunately, we've seen it with the indigenous population and others. And so gun violence and violence in this country is just not relegated to people of color. And Zena, I want to turn it back to you, because I know you do this work day in and day out. And from a policy perspective, can you kind of unpack for people what we are seeing across, the country? You talked a little bit about DV, domestic violence. There are so many different layers and levels to this. And I just can't have a conversation where we just look at it from one framework and associate it with one group of people.
Yeah, I think that that's something really important to highlight, and I think goes back to the original point of the fact that the issue is so broad in itself and it's so intersectional, which I think people tend to forget, right? There's a lot of also like things around hate crimes, right? Especially within the LGBTQ community. Suicide is another huge piece, particularly around a lot of older white men, especially in rural areas, but even in urban areas we've seen. And so obviously, I'm sure a lot of folks who are in this space and maybe not in this space have also seen some of the work Biden has done, specifically in terms of his kind of plan and the administration's plan to combat gun violence. And, there's some really key pieces in there that talk about a lot of the stuff that, we're already talking about on here, which is a lot of these community violence intervention programs. And then there's also more around especially youth and young people and being able to expand things like summer programming for them, right? And employment opportunities and, being able to help also formerly incarcerated individuals, right? Re-enter their respective communities. So I think the fact that just by looking at even from an executive level, a plan being so broad around policies that goes beyond, not that background checks, for example, aren't important, right? A plan that goes beyond some of these things is really speaks a little bit to that and the breadth of policies, I guess you could say. And I could probably go on and on about all of those different policies, but I'll just kind of leave it at that as one example of just seeing the breadth of the things that you can do because the issue is so big.
Right. And I think just from hearing you speak and reading the comments in the chat, we have folks that are bringing up emphasis on the mental health piece, on the trauma that so many folks in our communities experience. I mean, it is a really deeply layered and complicated issue. But I think one of the things that has been interesting in this moment where we have been dealing with multiple pandemics, where we've been dealing with COVID-19, where we've been dealing with an economic crisis, where we've been dealing with, you know, a rise in gun violence across the country. It's just so multi-layered and faceted. But one of those issues that has also come to the forefront has been around police reform. And reimagining policing, for lack of a better term, because, you know, I think quite frankly, when we're hearing from the community and we're, you know, listening to young people and our activists that are out in the street and, you know, really trying to bring attention to these issues and bring forth ideas about how we chart a better way, reform sometimes doesn't even seem strong enough a term. You know, one of the things that we have been looking at the National Urban League is about redefining public safety and what that really means. Obviously, addressing gun violence and really supporting more social service programs and cure violence efforts is a part of that and an important piece. But I, you know, sometimes I worry about, we're having this conversation around police reform and the response is, well, because we've been focusing so much on police reform, this is why we have these issues of gun violence. I don't really think it is an either or. You can either have a safe community with policing in the current way that it is happening, or you have gun violence. I think there's more we can do. And Mark, as someone who has, you know, really delved into this issue from many perspectives, I would love to hear from you about the conundrum that we're hearing in the community, in the media, and from different, you know, different corners about police reform and gun violence. You know, is the rise that we're seeing a response to efforts around police reform? Is it a response from law enforcement itself and pulling back? Is it response, or is it more endemic of the moment that we're in right now with COVID and unemployment and other things? I know that was a really long question. Tackle whatever piece of it you want.
Well, it's important. I think what's important is, as we examine gun violence, it's important that we all are operating or have the same level of understanding. We have to know what we're talking about. And definitions are important too. You know, sometimes in different parts of the country, you may talk about gun violence, and what they're talking about primarily is, you know, assault weapons and long guns and the crime and violence and mass shootings related to those particular items. I think what's much more prevalent, especially within the inner cities and communities throughout the country, is the prevalence of guns and that violence related to that. As far as police reform is concerned, we have to, and I think we've been taught a valuable lesson. We have to be careful not to just use bumper sticker terms when we're talking about issues as complex as reforming or reimagining what policing is. I go as far as saying that we have to shift away from a policing model to a public safety model, which incorporates the brilliance of these, you know, crisis management systems that Sister Ebony was referring to, with street corner resources is key in New York in regards to, you know, I think it's hard to quantify how many lives are saved when you have that type of direct intervention. And in large part because it's non-traditional. People aren't accustomed to non-police actually taking a proactive role in decreasing violence, hands-on, very direct. And before I move on, I wanted to say I was disappointed Ebony didn't mention that Friday night open mic that they do too, because there were many a time that I felt like jumping on there and doing a freestyle. But aside from that, I think if we begin to examine programs and structures and operations such as what Street Corner Resources has been doing, and Sister Aisha Sekou and the brilliant young Ebony is doing, that is more significant and substantive. Crime is not responding, violence is not responding to the police being upset or getting their feelings hurt. Let me tell you something about police. Police operate under two premises. It's either the carrot or the stick. If they're not getting the carrot, they whine and complain because the police believe that they should be lionized and treated as they are above the law. They should never have their feelings hurt. It should be very low restrictions on them. We can't be led and guided by the sensitivities of police. We understand the need for policing services. Many of us believe we should be shifting towards public safety, but we understand the value of policing. But they're not the only game in town. And the level of violence that has increased is multifaceted, as we discussed. It's part economy. It's part the prevalence or the increase in gang and clique activity. There are other beefs and issues that have been going on for long periods of time. There was a rise in general crime that began prior to COVID. But since COVID, there seems to be an increase in this violent crime. So it's multifaceted. What we can't do and shouldn't play into is allowing the police to say, see what happens when you tie our hands, when you try to reform or change us. You'll hear the police oftentimes say, let us do our job. And we're all for that. All of us are for that. We just want to make sure that the job that they have to do is within the guidelines of the laws. That's all we've ever asked for. That's all we ever expect of our policing. And we could have this wonderful, collaborative, cooperative relationship that incorporates not only the police for their enforcement models, but mental health professionals can be incorporated into this. These crisis management systems should be incorporated and given a part of it, and begin to farm out, if you will, different responsibilities where police have shown a pattern of difficulty in handling these situations, because we want to minimize all levels of violence in communities across the nation.
Absolutely. I mean, there were so many nuggets in there. And I think is really important when we're talking about public safety. What that really means is that we need to have community at the table for those conversations. And I think there's, when we're thinking of communities, and oftentimes communities of color, we're dealing with gun violence, but we're also dealing with historically experiences with unfair and unjust policing, where communities feel like they're policed differently than other segments of the society. So it is,
and that's been established, and that's been established. It's irrefutable that policing, in large part, and problems with policing is because policing has become, or has always been, let's be clear, race-based. We need to acknowledge that and then decide that we're going to move away from that more towards a service model, a public safety model, which says we're here to provide a particular service to you. But we just can't be bullied by police entities that really get up in their feelings when you request that they do things differently.
Absolutely. I'm reading the chat. We're hearing from folks talking about mental health screening being important when we're talking about policing, as much as in the same way that we're talking about more social services and support that needs to go to our community. It also needs to be go to the folks that are policing our community. Trauma, folks that are dealing with tragedy over and over and over again is not healthy for any of us. And so when we're talking about investing in our communities, when we're talking about grappling with gun violence, we really need to be thinking broader than we have. We've been very narrow. So I'm happy that the conversation has turned in that direction, and that we are seeing more focus on social services and creative ways to deal with the issues at hand, and speaking to people who are closest to the problem, because they are more often than not closest to the solutions too. Ebony, I want to turn it back to you because I think we can be in certain cities and certain areas, and depending on who is leading your government there, who your governor is, or who your city, who your mayor is, the response may be different. But I think it's important to focus also on what's happening nationally. So I would love to hear from you about what you think is missing from the national conversation around gun violence. What should we be talking about that we just aren't?
Yeah. Well, first things first is mental health, because again, most of these situations are people who are broken and hurting and don't know another path to find a solution. So it's all about our perception and what we perceive to be our realities. If we don't see another way out of a situation, then people may tend to fall into these patterns of thinking of the people that are surrounding them. And so nationally, I believe that it really starts with how we interact with each other, the things that we're taught in school. It stems so deeply into our thought pattern, really, and what we think is possible for ourselves. For people who are close to those situations, like you said, I also believe that, you know, those people who would be the perpetrators of the violence can also be the solvers, you know, and figuring this whole thing out with what to do with our pain and our trauma, how to experience it and work through it, live through it. It's all very connected, and I think that with gun violence in particular, we can prevent a lot if we focus on these people as individuals and not just groups of minorities, not just groups of gang members, for example. It's really about the individual and the situations that they are in, where if they don't see another way, they can fall victim to this violence.
We have to see another way. I mean, this problem isn't going away until we actually do something and act. And when I think about acting, Zenith, I think about Parkland. I think about, you know, the March for Our Lives and how it came into fruition. I mean, I even think as far back as what it was like when I was in school and Columbine happened. I mean, we saw Newtown. I mean, it's like the list just keeps going on and never ends. And each time we have this moment where people are, you know, moved to act, but we don't see action on the federal level. So while I'm heartened by a lot of the focus on gun violence and the efforts coming out of, you know, the executive office of the White House and the presidency, we also need our representatives on the state, local, and federal level, specifically our members of Congress and of the Senate, to move and to act. I'm curious to hear from you what you think is the barrier. What are the challenges we're seeing? Is it the NRA? Is it, you know, emphasis on the Second Amendment? What's stopping people from moving when we see so many people in our society hurting because of this issue?
Yeah. I think there's a variety of factors, but I want to take it back a little bit. I know you were talking about Columbine and Sandy Hook and obviously Parkland as well. And really, the really heartbreaking statistic, especially for young people, is now, I think before a couple of years ago, it was second, but now firearms are actually the leading cause of death in the United States for children and teens. And I think it's really disheartening, especially for young people who work so hard, speaking on the federal level, but even, you know, state and local elections in 2020, to get people elected who are going to represent them, have their best interest in mind, and to see so many things be halted or not acted upon. I think one of the biggest things that, you know, my experience working in terms of the federal level that we've seen is really this filibuster piece and a lot of these, you know, nuanced rules and procedural things that just block life-saving legislation from moving forward. You know, every day 100 people die from gun violence. And so every day that these things go on and on and on, 100 more people die, and that's across, you know, the entire country. And for the United States, you know, it's really disheartening to see that. And also for young people, it's really heartbreaking to see that. And, you know, specifically speaking to the Biden administration, I mean, it's definitely great that, you know, we have a president and an administration who's highlighting some of these key critical GVP pieces, but I don't think that there's a sense of urgency across the board on how critical and important this issue is. You know, we really need the administration to make this issue a priority, right? And one of the things I know from our organizational standpoint that we've been asking for is the administration really needs to appoint someone who can handle this issue at a senior level, and a national gun violence director. And, you know, to folks' points a couple minutes ago, really be able to bring in those that are closest to the problem and have those conversations, because those folks are also closest to the solution. And so I think that, you know, from a federal standpoint, those are kind of some of the barriers. And then, essentially those kind of trickle down and mimic themselves at a state level and a local level. Thinking about our system of democracy in connection with, the system of oppression that our country was built on is something to keep in mind. Obviously, democracy is supposed to allow us to be active and engaged members, but there's so many things that are continuing these systems of oppressions, especially for communities of color, their ability to vote, right, for example, and be able to be engaged in the public service process. So just so many different things to keep in mind that you wouldn't even think of when you think of like gun violence, right?
Really important. And I think the civic engagement piece is one to lift up. We can't think about this separately. We can't talk about it's important for folks to move on this issue, and we don't continue to make it an issue at the ballot box. We need to elect folks who are committed to doing the work, who care, who get it, and, quite frankly, aren't going to be influenced by other outside factors or money or organizations that I think, unfortunately, are perpetuating the problem. We've seen here in New York a whole comprehensive plan around combating gun violence and really also holding manufacturers accountable for for guns getting into the wrong hands. I think it's important for us to recognize that the accountability is on all of us and at every single level. One of the things that I saw in the chat were folks talking about the role of the media and entertainment industry and these corporations. I think it speaks to the stats that you mentioned earlier, Zenith, with, 100 deaths, 100 people die a day here in this country. We are hard pressed to find any other country that has the same type of loss as this, that's seen as, a major industrial country. And it's really quite frightening. I don't really know how we explain that. You think with more resources, more opportunities, that this wouldn't be the response. So at the end of the day, I think there's a lot more work to do and a lot more that we need to do to continue this conversation. But as we come to a close, I think it's really important to be able to speak to action items for you all to tell a little bit about how folks can connect with your organizations if they're interested in working with you. And also just how can an everyday person, an average person who may not already be engaged in this movement, really to stop and bring an end to gun violence, how can they get involved? Ebony, let's start with you.
Yes, so with Street Corner, again, we are based in Harlem on 145th. And I have to mention now, we do our Peace Cafe once a month, every last Friday of the month.
Amazing.
Yes, so we're live on our Facebook page, and we invite the community to come out and share any positive, peaceful, and clean music and art, anything. We get a lot of great spoken word, and people just really express themselves in ways. So that's what we have. In addition to that, we have our music studio, where young people are invited to come again, create positive music. And it's really that access, giving things to do, things to feel grateful and proud of. It also helps them find their purpose. Street Corner Resources is here again. You can call our office. I'll give you our phone number.
Ebony, we're losing you. Can you go back closer to the phone? Yes, we hear you. Let's say that number loud and clear for everyone.
Yes. Our phone number is 212-694-8759. Again, our main office is on 145th Street, and we are open. Please come stop by our office. We have lots of services, education, training, and referrals to help as well.
Thank you so much for that and for sharing that information. Zenith, I'll go to you. Can you tell us more about how folks who are interested in connecting with March for Our Lives can do so, or how that folks can just get involved in the gun violence movement generally?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as March for Our Lives, we're a national organization, so we have student-led chapters all across the country, high school, college, some local chapters. I think we've also got some chapters in middle school, so that's really awesome to see. And one way to get involved with that is like just head to our website, and you'll be able to contact us and plug in and see where kind of our programming is. You can also DM us. We're very active on social media, as you've probably seen, and we will make sure you're plugged into our work. We've got a lot of exciting campaign and work happening. We just launched a really cool campaign called Peace Without Police, which is really great. And 25 of our chapters are participating on that, specifically talking about funding resources in schools that students consider to keep them safe versus investing continuously in school resource officers and such. So that's some really cool work we're doing, and we've got some great work coming up as well. And I think in terms of just plugging into the work, I really want to thank everybody. I want to thank y'all for hosting the conversation and, you know, being able to speak alongside y'all. But I think just really educating yourself on what's happening by staying updated with Instagram lives and other social things like this, but also see what's happening in your local community. There's a lot of great orgs, you know, doing really wonderful things in their community, specifically with violence intervention work, as Ebony has kind of mentioned too, around some of the stuff that she's doing. And then also, like, if you're able to, right, I think mutual aid is also a huge part of this. And so something to keep in mind if you have the financial ability to give to folks. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you so much. And Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of close us out. We'd love to hear some final thoughts, some final words, and any encouragement you have for folks that are really interested in getting involved and working in this space.
Well, thank you so much, Jerica, for this opportunity, and thank you to National Urban League. Our organization respects and will respond when called upon, and really appreciate really this opportunity to share some of our message. We're here to provide whatever support, whatever information we can, just based on our practical experience working in law enforcement. Our members are from the various agencies, law enforcement agencies, local, federal, and we're willing to provide whatever assistance and information we can, hopefully to have our dialogue lead to some really impactful changes, and being supportive of other organizations is part of that. So we are really promoting and working alongside of organizations such as Street Corner Resources and other organizations throughout the country. Our contact information, our phone, our landline is 917-289-0950. And our Twitter page is Black Alliance, the number one. And that's also our Facebook page as well. So we're here, we're available. We offer commentary through various different mediums and different stations. I'm quite regular on some of the national news stations, just offering perspective on issues that relate primarily to the Black community and law enforcement. So it's really been an honor, and I'm supportive of all the efforts that were spoken about today.
Well, thanks so much, Mark, and thank you, Ebony and Zenith. We really appreciate all your perspectives. I think one thing is important to remember is it's going to take all of us working together. It's all about the collective, and it's coalition building time. The problem is monumental, and not one organization, one person can get it done alone. So I just thank you all for your leadership, in your advocacy, and your continued work in this space. And just thank you for joining us today. And so to everyone watching, thanks again for joining us for Justice Now. We'll be back on the 17th to talk about voting. A huge issue. We touched on it here, but it's really, really a powerful one, and one that is driving a lot of the issues and the challenges that we are dealing with today. So thanks again for joining us. And remember, the time for justice is always now. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, Jerica. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.